So like I said, tort law is often considered malpractice law in healthcare, and it's dealing with the duties and rights among individuals and often involves claims for damages. Oops. Now, these are the kinds of torts that you can get involved in nursing practice if you're not careful. And we need to be very mindful to follow the law, follow the standards of practice, so that we aren't called and named in a court case in a tort. And so there's intentional torts, assault and battery. The way this plays out, now we usually think of, someone getting beat up on the street for assault and battery, but we can assault and batter a patient. So specifically performing a procedure without consent. This came up a lot of times in the ER because the police would bring in someone who was being pulled over for a DUI, and they'd want a drug test run, which is you have to get a blood test. To see, if what this patient was under the influence of. And if the patient consented for me to draw their blood, I would do so. And if the patient did not consent for me to draw their blood, I would not do so because I am not there. I work for the hospital and I have a patient. The patient is my person, not the police. And so I would never do that. In fact, there was a case out in Utah where a nurse did refuse the exact same thing, and they ended up handcuffing that ER nurse and putting her in the back of the police car for refusing to draw blood on a patient who was not consenting. But never perform a procedure on a patient without consent. Now, there can be false imprisonment, restraining a client against her will or his will. And this is where making sure if you do restraints, you have to have impeccable documentation to show the need for it, the medical order for it, that you're following all of the requirements so that you're not pulled into court for false imprisonment. Invasion of privacy, breach of confidentiality, talking about a patient on the elevator, posting something on social media, taking a selfie at work with your best friend in the hallway and a patient's face is in the background. A breach of privacy, breach of confidentiality. Fraud, failing to provide essential information for informed consent. We have to tell our patients what we're doing and why it would benefit them and what the risks are for informed consent. Patient abandonment. You can't just walk out in the middle of your shift and be like, I'm over. And if you're over, then you better hand your patients off to another nurse, because if you just walk out and abandon, you can be held liable for malpractice for patient abandonment. And then negligence. Negligence means failure to perform as a reasonable, prudent person would. Failure to follow the standards of practice. You don't have to have an intentional idea of harming a person. It doesn't have to be intentional, but it just means failure to do what you should have done. And this is why you need to, nursing school is no joke. And there is no phoning it in nursing school, because you need to know every little thing we're teaching you so that you can perform as a reasonable, prudent person would, and you can follow those standards of practice. If this scares you a little bit, it probably should, because healthcare law is no joke and patients trust us. Our governments issue our license as nurses to practice in society, and they held us to a standard so that they can keep the society safe. And it's our job to perform as a reasonable, prudent nurse would in the same situation. Now, in order for a tort claim or to be won by the plaintiff, there has to be a professional form of negligence. And there have to be 4 elements necessary for that plaintiff to prove that negligence existed. So write these down. You're going to want to know these 4. There's 4 elements that are necessary to prove negligence in tort law. Existence of a duty. So whoever the defendant is has to have some kind of duty to have some kind of relationship with that patient, some kind of duty to treat them, some kind of involvement. So if you're walking down the street and you see someone collapse and you choose not to engage with them, you had no duty to do so. And hopefully you would, as a Good Samaritan would, and we're protected under Good Samaritan law for that. But if a patient comes to the hospital and you're assigned that patient, then you have a duty to care for that patient. If you're working in a clinic and the patient comes in and you're triaging them, you have a duty then to care for that patient. A breach of duty means you were supposed to care for them and there was some failure of you to do that. Causation. So something happened and they have to show that it was because you did something or because you didn't do something you should have. So there has to be a correlation, a link between the injury or illness that transpired and what you did or didn't do as a nurse. There has to be a direct link into how that happened. And then finally, damages. Damages means something happened, like some kind of injury, illness, some kind of outcome happened to the patient that affected them negatively. And so in order for someone to win a malpractice, a negligence tort, they have to show that there was a duty to care for the patient from the person being accused. There has to be a breach of duty. They failed to do something or they did something they shouldn't have. That there was a direct link between what the nurse or doctor did or didn't do and the injury, and that there was some kind of injury or mal effect. So those 4 elements are necessary for negligence. Okay, so if you're not already a little bit scared, you should be. It's good to have a healthy respect for what we do, recognizing that we are, we have great power to do good and we also have great power to do harm. But how do we minimize malpractice risk? We never want to get that subpoena from a lawyer saying that we're named in a court case. Terrifying, right? So how do we minimize this malpractice risk? Well, here's some tips. Practice proper documentation. You'll hear this a lot in nursing school. If it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. I'll tell you that case that I was called to do my deposition in, I was not named in the case, but it was no less terrifying. And my documentation was solid, it was appropriate, but it was a little sparse. And quite frankly, it's because it was a really healthy kid. I did my assessment, I did a very basic documentation, and I moved on with my day. And 3 years later, when this came to court, boy, I would have really liked it if I had gone a little bit more into detail on my documentation. They weren't able to hold anything against me in my deposition, but it just would have been nice if a little bit more was there in the written record. So if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. Follow your standards of practice. Know them upside down and sideways. Use your nursing process and follow those professional standards. Think back to week 1 when we talked about professional identity and we wrote down all of the ANA standards and scope of practice. Make sure, I had you post that somewhere, so make sure you look at that. And if you haven't done that yet, go back and do that with the ANA scope and standards of practice and post it on your fridge, put it in your car, put it somewhere to keep that very mindful and front and center for you. Avoid medication and treatment errors. Follow your 6 rights of medication. It's foolproof if you do it right every time and you slow down and you do your 3 checks on every medication. 6 rights, 3 checks, right? 3 times. We check it before we get it out, as we're preparing it, and as at the bedside before we give it to the patient. Report and document accurately. Your documentation matters. At the end of a 12-hour shift, if you're tired and you just want to go home, don't cut corners on your documentation. Stay and do it correctly. Obtain informed consent on special procedures, making sure that it is written and that you've got all of your T's crossed and your I's dotted on your informed consent paperwork. And then make sure that you focus on client safety. Patient safety is key, and that's a major part of malpractice is some kind of patient safety error. So just be tuned into safety. We talk about it in week 1 and 107 for a reason, and it needs to carry through everything we do in nursing practice. Let's take look at a few more. Maintain client confidentiality, both with written record, what you're saying, with your phones, with social media. Provide education and counseling. Make sure you're delegating to people appropriately and delegating tasks that are appropriate to delegate. Only accept appropriate assignments. If the doctor told me to go put a chest tube in room 2, I would say, no, thank you, that it's not within my scope of practice. So making sure that you understand what you can and cannot do. Participate in continuing education to stay up on your own knowledge of this stuff. Observe professional boundaries. Maintain regulatory reporting regulations. So if you have a patient that we are mandated reporters for things like child abuse. And so if you're noticing a concern for child abuse, you must report that appropriately or you can be held liable. Be aware of legal safeguards for nursing, just like the things we're talking about today, and consider having nursing malpractice insurance. It's not expensive. It's maybe about $100 a year, and it can really cover you in case there is any risk for malpractice. And quite frankly, we're all at risk of malpractice, and I think having a little malpractice insurance is a wise idea. I'll have you take a look at your interrelated concepts in your Giddens text. Economics, policy, ethics, and quality all impact and influence healthcare law and vice versa. There are a number of exemplars in your book: Medicare and Medicaid, EMTALA, HIPAA, HITECH, the ACA, and Federal False Claims Act. You really need to know all of these things to be able to practice well as a nurse, but I want you to especially focus on HIPAA. So listen, it can be a little intimidating when you talk about the legal aspects of nursing practice. And that's okay. It needs to be a little intimidating, and it needs to be something we're cognizant of throughout our nursing practice. So as you're growing in this as a student, keep in mind those healthcare laws, your nursing standard of practice, your accrediting bodies, and the regulatory requirements that are being asked of you. Ask your clinical instructors in 108 how they manage the legal aspects of nursing and how they follow the standards of practice. And keep your scope and standards of practice front and center until they are just completely memorized by you. See you next time.